Hi, I'm Leo Finelli, and you're listening to Generation Change.
This March, we're sharing an interview with one of the youth leaders behind last year's biggest climate protest. Keanu Arpels-Josiah is a core organizer of Fridays for Future in New York City, where he advocates for action on climate justice and legislation on the local, state, federal, and international government levels. In 2023, he was one of the lead organizers of the March to End Fossil Fuels, a 75,000 person march in New York City calling on President Biden to end fossil fuels. He also serves on the electoral and legislative teams of Sunrise Movement NYC and helps coordinate and organize around local policy and legislative campaigns as a policy lead for Fridays for Future. Keanu shared about striking outside City Hall, organizing the March to End Fossil Fuels, and going to COP28 in Dubai. Our conversation starts now. So let's start with your family story. How did you end up in New York City?
Yeah, so I've grown up in New York City my whole life. My mom was born and raised in New York, and my dad immigrated to New York when he was 10 from India. So I've grown up in New York my whole life.
What were you interested in and fascinated by as a little kid?
That's a great question. Many things. The climate crisis, though, has always been a part of, I think, my life growing up and my perception of my future, as well as just how I thought about the world, and thought about my life as far back as I can remember. And I think that's really what led me down the path that ended up my climate activism, which really started in high school. But the entire time, even in middle school, I remember caring about the climate crisis. Whenever I had a chance with a school project to learn about the climate crisis, I would always pick that. And it's always been a big part of my life.
So what drew you to Fridays for Future New York City?
Yeah, so Fridays for Future in 2019, the Fridays for Future movement really kicked off. It started in 2018, really with Greta Thunberg strikes outside of the Swedish parliament. But in 2019 is really when it catapulted into a global movement. And really what first brought my attention to it was reading about Greta Thunberg. My dad showed me some articles about her when I was younger, and I just went down like a rabbit hole of reading about her and felt really inspired about her work. And then in 2019, I went to the Fridays for Future strike that happened in New York City. 200,000 people marched in the streets for climate justice. It was the biggest march globally that we had ever seen for the climate. And those school strikes really first brought my attention to Fridays for Future and also awakened me to, like, even as a high schooler, I can do something about the climate crisis. I don't have to wait to graduate high school. I don't have to wait, but I can start right now. The climate crisis is already something that we can do. That's something I can act on. So the school strike in 2019 really brought my attention to it. And then during COVID, I didn't really get involved until around 2022, when I remember finding the New York City chapter, Fridays for Future, initially as a school hub captain. We have hub captains at different schools across the city here in New York City. So I helped mobilize people from my school to the 2022 March global strike, and we had around, I think, 3,000 people at that strike in March of 2022. And then after that, I realized how easy it was to get involved. And the other thing that really surprised me is just how little people were actually involved in the climate movement. I think before you're involved, you have this perception that the climate movement is massive and there are many people involved. You have an expectation of Zoom meetings with like 25 people to 50 people, right? And the first Fridays for Future meeting I joined was around 6 people total, I think. So that really surprised me at first. And it reminded me of just how many more people this movement needed, and that my capacity that I could bring to Fridays for Future and to this movement was very needed. So then since then, I got really involved in FF, and here I am still doing this work.
And where do you strike with your friends every Friday?
Yeah, so we strike outside of City Hall every Friday in New York City. There's strikes around the world at different FF chapters. In New York City, we're outside City Hall. Some FF chapters don't strike every Friday. It's really just a part of building community, and building community that's super important to activism.
What do you like about your friends who strike with you?
Yeah, so it's really important, I think, to build community around people who are conscious about our changing world, conscious about the changing climate, and conscious about the role we can play in taking action. So the people that are part of Fridays for Future and the people that I've met throughout the climate movement, to be honest, it's been really great to meet so many people who really care about this issue and really are compassionate.
And when you and your friends are sitting out there with your signs, do people walking by look at you or say anything? How do they react? What do they think or say when they walk by and see all these kids with these signs just outside City Hall?
Yeah, so sometimes it's a great way to start conversations. People will come up and be like, why are you sitting out here with signs? Sometimes people have thought we were asking for money, and we had to clarify that we were not. But really, it's a great way, again, to build community. For the march this September, we were one of the main organizations organizing the March to End Fossil Fuels this September in New York City, where we had 75,000 people take to the streets. And all summer long, we'd be outside City Hall, around the city, honestly, also handing out flyers. But every Friday, we'd be outside City Hall handing out flyers for the march. And that was a great way to engage community, build awareness around the march happening in September, and ultimately helping lead to that 75,000 person turnout we were not expecting.
And what else did you do to plan that march?
Yeah, so the march really was a long planning process starting back in April of 2023 and then going all the way until September 17th when we were out on the streets. And it was really a big coalition that came together. We had around 800 organizations throughout the country and world that ended up signing on an endorsement of the march and coming out onto the streets of New York. And there's a core group of around 10 to 12 organizations that we really spent the summer working in close tandem with, organizing in every way from logistics to having marshals on the streets, to the stage, to the program, to handing out flyers across the city, to spreading the word on social media and emails, all of these events we had ahead of the march, reaching out to elected officials to sign on an endorsement and come to the march, really was a really big project for so many people. And even the morning of, we were expecting at most 20,000 people. We were really ready to be happy with that number, and not at all expecting the 75,000 people that took to the streets that Sunday.
So what specific steps did you call for politicians to take to end fossil fuels?
Yeah, so the march in September was really focused on President Biden. We saw a president who ran for office promising to be a climate leader. In a CNN town hall ahead of the election in 2020, he looked a young voter in the eye and said, "I promise I will end fossil fuel." But here we are, and he's continued to expand fossil fuels at a record rate, approving projects faster than any other country in the world and faster than previous presidents, all while claiming to be a climate leader. Those things are completely unconscionable with each other, and that's what we were calling out. We saw the Willow Project approved back in 2023, massive oil drilling project in Alaska. We saw countless other projects approved throughout the country, throughout the Gulf South, the Gulf of Mexico, throughout the country. And we see the US as the biggest producer of oil and gas worldwide, the biggest exporter of oil and gas as well, and the historic biggest emitter in the climate crisis. So the US has a particular role to take action here, and President Biden has continuously declined to do so. So we called on him to, for one, stop approvals of new fossil fuel projects. That's really the bare minimum. We can't keep expanding in the wrong direction and continuing to claim climate leadership. It's been clear from science to the UN across the board that new fossil fuels are just completely out of line with human rights, with what we need as humanity to survive. So that's really the basic level of it. No new fossil fuel approvals. Right now, President Biden is considering to approve CP2, which is a massive LNG export terminal, fracked gas export terminal in Louisiana. And it alone would be 20 times the emissions of the Willow project. So that is something he cannot approve. And there's 20 other projects in Louisiana and throughout the Gulf South that he's continuing to approve. So we're really calling on him not to approve any more projects, including those. Secondly, we were calling on him to declare a climate emergency. The declaration of a climate emergency under the Federal Emergency Management Act is something that's critical to transitioning us away from fossil fuels to just renewable energy. So a climate emergency was one of our key demands for him and has been a clear demand on the Biden administration for a long time. Actually, in August, ahead of the march, he claimed to have already have declared a climate emergency once to a reporter when he simply has not. So he really just needs to take the step to actually do it. And then another one of our key demands was a transition away from fossil fuels, a halt of fossil fuel exports, and a transition to renewable community-based energy. Really, there's a lot that the executive branch, that President Biden can do by himself without congressional approval, and a lot he can stop doing to actively be bringing us in the wrong direction on this issue. So that's what we were calling out.
Are you familiar with the concept of eco-anxiety?
Yeah, I feel it all the time, and so do millions, if not billions, of people around the world.
It's kept me awake at night and made me cry.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that. That's the reality of the climate crisis. The mental health toll that the climate crisis has is massive. And I think really what we need to do with our eco-anxiety is try to turn it into action. That's what's been most helpful for me personally. There's so much that we can do as individuals, not just to take individual small actions, but really to pressure broader institutions to take action here. And that is a really good outlet for eco-anxiety.
Even when you're dealing with life-threatening issues and planning protests, it's important to take care of yourself, be silly, and have fun. How do you and your friends do that?
How do we do that? Yeah, I mean, I think we're all high schoolers, we're all teenagers as well. So the same way other teenagers do it. Love to read, love to watch movies, love to do all of the things that teenagers do to have fun and unplug. It can be a lot doing activism and doing school. We know the mental health toll that school has around the world on high schoolers, specifically in the US, is really massive, and it can be a lot to be doing anything in addition to high school. So it's so important to take time to make sure you're taking care of yourself, to make sure you're having time to just be a high schooler, to just be a teenager. That's super critical to any sort of activism. It's all about the balance there. You can't just be doing this work 24/7. You need to take time for yourself to unplug.
I agree. What college will you be going to?
Unknown as of now. Yeah, college applications have been sent, awaiting results.
What kind of career would you like to have in the future, if you can have a future at all?
Such a big question. I don't know, but I think really as I think about my future, I think thinking about my role, what I can do to take action on the climate crisis, what I can do to ensure that whatever profession I go into, whatever profession anyone goes into, just being thoughtful about how that can advance climate justice. And there's really so many fields that can affect climate justice work. You don't have to just be an advocate. You don't just have to be a policy person in order to take action on these issues, to push these things forward, from art to technology to across the board. There's so many different fields you can go into and also put pressure on this issue. I think my particular interests would probably lead me down the policy road, but I'm still sort of figuring that out as of now.
I would love to hear a little bit more about your time in Dubai last month.
People keep asking me, how is Dubai? And I have no word of response other than crazy, unless I'm going to be like emotional and then have a long conversation. But yeah, it's so insane that our climate conference last year was in an oil state and led by a current oil executive. And now here we're headed to Azerbaijan, where it's again led by a former oil executive. The Azerbaijan COP29 committee was initially all men, that they announced it was like 29 or 30 all men announced to lead the COP29 summit, which is completely out of line with any sort of progress. So it's critical that I think we keep in mind looking at COP29, looking at COP28, looking at these international conferences that yes, they can have a role to move the needle forward, but they're really, really, really full with fossil fuel interests. We saw 2,456 fossil fuel lobbyists on the ground in Dubai. That's the more than 4 times the previous number, the most amount of fossil fuel lobbyists at any of these previous conferences. So that means that the fossil fuel industry reach is really big, but it also means they're scared. It also means we're having a difference. We saw the words fossil fuels in the text for the first time in all of history. In 28 years of conferences, not once have we mentioned fossil fuels. So the transition away from fossil fuels is important. It's important that we got that in there, and that's thanks to all of the organizing around the world. That's thanks to the 600,000 people that marched in the streets in September worldwide. That's thanks to years and years of organizing at these conferences to get those words in the text. But we saw pretty much every other word filled with loopholes, so many failed initiatives, so short of where we need to be. No other way to say that. And it's insane that it's taken us this long to mention fossil fuels in this text. But really, these international agreements, we need to take it as a sign that our movement is making an impact. We can't look at these agreements as the end-all be-all of climate action. Really, what needs to change is the actions of national and local governments throughout the world. We saw the US administration, and this was in large part of the pushing of advocates around the country from the front lines in the US to youth in the US, pushing the US position in the negotiations. And we saw Secretary Kerry make a statement calling for a phase out of fossil fuels in the US, a rapid phase down of fossil fuels by 2030 in the US. And that's really, really critical to make sure that we are reducing our emissions starting today in the US, reducing our fossil fuel production. We can't just look at this in terms of emissions. We can't get lost in dangerous distractions and false solutions like carbon capture and storage and other false conspiracies from the fossil fuel industry. We have to take real action to reduce our fossil fuel production, and that really needs to be the message coming out of COP, and one that hopefully President Biden will be listening. We know that if we're in the nightmare of Biden versus Trump again in the general election, we need Biden to be reelected. But what he needs to know is that for him to get reelected, for him to have the record youth turnout that he needs to win this election, he needs to take a stronger stance on climate. He needs to take a stronger stance on fossil fuels. So really, really, the message to the Biden campaign, the message to President Biden needs to be better on fossil fuels in order to win this election. We need you to win this election, but we also need you to be better on our future, be better on basic human rights, and be better on the climate crisis and fossil fuel expansion.
Thank you for telling the world that, and thank you for coming on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was great to meet you. Look forward to seeing the podcast come out. How long have you been doing podcasts, can I ask?
My first episode was released in November of 2020, and I've done a new one every month for over 3 years. I get to talk about our shared passions with new friends and interesting people, and I get to not only make change in the world and call attention to these issues, but I can do so without having to do it alone.
That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thanks so much again for having me on. It was great to meet you.
It was great to meet you too. Bye.
Thanks, Leo. Bye.
When we recorded this episode in January, the petition Keanu mentioned, the one to stop CP2, was still collecting signatures. Since we recorded, the Biden administration has paused all new natural gas projects to evaluate their environmental impact. This decision may hopefully become a permanent ban on new natural gas projects, but it may not, which is why it's important that you keep demanding change from your politicians. If you live in Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, or Virginia, then your state's primary elections are on Tuesday, March 5th. Early voting is already open, so go be a voter and go make your voice heard. And you can follow Keanu on Instagram at Keanu_8064. That's at KEANU_8064. If you'd like to recommend someone to be on the show, or if you would like to be on the show, email us at generationchange@leofinelli.com. Please follow us on Instagram at GenChangeWithLF. That's at GenChangeWithLF. Subscribe and review wherever you get your podcasts, and share this with your friends and others. Generation Change with Leo Finelli is hosted by Leo Finelli, executive produced by Julie Finelli, and edited by Nick and Leo Finelli. Our original music was composed and performed by Leo Finelli. Thank you so much for listening.